The room went quiet when Margaret said my daughter's name, not the gentle kind of quiet. The kind that presses against your ears and makes everyone suddenly very interested in their glasses, their napkins, the crease in the tablecloth, the kind of quiet that signals a correction is coming, and no one wants to be the target. "Emily," Margaret said, smiling like she was offering advice, "why don't you stop hovering and do something useful? Clear the table. It's of odd areas not." We were at a family engagement dinner. White tablecloths, linen napkins folded too tightly, crystal glasses arranged for photographs, not comfort. A photographer stood near the window, waiting for candid moments that looked warm enough to post later. Emily was 16. She wore a pale blue dress she had paid for herself with tutoring money. She had already helped an aunt carry dishes earlier. 5 minutes before this, no one had noticed her. Now every adult at the table was watching her carefully, measuring what she would do next. I stayed seated. That part matters. Margaret's eyes flicked toward me, then back to Emily. "This isn't a restaurant," she added lightly. "We all contribute, especially young people who live under other people's roofs." A few people laughed. Not loudly, just enough to signal agreement without responsibility. Emily nodded. She always nodded first. I watched her shoulders dip slightly, the way they do when someone adjusts to a weight they've been carrying longer than anyone realizes. She reached for the nearest plate. That was when I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't touch her arm. I said one sentence, evenly, with no explanation attached. "Emily, leave the plates." She looked at me, surprised. The room leaned in. Silence thickened. Margaret blinked. "Laura, it's just," I said, "leave them." Aiding Duvelin, Emily placed the plate back on the table. Her hands were steady. That mattered more to me than anything else in that moment. Margaret straightened in her chair. "We're not doing this tonight." I nodded once. "We are." No one moved. Someone cleared their throat. The photographer took a step back, then another, lowering his camera without being asked. I walked to the sideboard and picked up a small cream-colored envelope I had placed there earlier. No name written on it, no stamp, just weight. I carried it back and set it gently beside Emily's folded napkin. "This is yours," I said to my daughter. "You don't need to open it yet." Margaret laughed, sharp and confused. "What is this? A performance?" I looked at her for the first time that evening. "No, it's a correction." That word landed. I saw it register before she masked it. Around us, chairs shifted. Glasses were lifted and set down without drinking. The kind of movement people make when they want the moment to pass without them being remembered in it. Margaret leaned forward. "If you have an issue, Laura, we can discuss it privately. There's no need to embarrass anyone." I stayed standing. I didn't pull my chair out. Emily was just publicly instructed to work while being spoken about as if she weren't here. That already happened. Emily didn't look at Margaret. She looked at the envelope. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "Teenagers are sensitive. Structure isn't abuse." I smiled, not warmly. "Precisely. This isn't about sensitivity. It's about roles." Her son shifted beside her. "Let's not derail the evening." I turned to him. The evening was already directed. Margaret's voice hardened. "She helps. That's good for her. It builds character." I let a beat pass. Silence can function like an affidavit if you allow it to. Then I said, "Character is built by choice. Labor without choice is something else." And no one interrupted me. I picked up my glass, took a single sip, and set it down. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me, even then. Margaret's smile returned, brittle now. "You've always been dramatic, Laura. Since Daniel passed, you've struggled to adjust. We've been patient." There it was, concern framed as authority. "I adjusted," I said, quietly. Emily finally looked up at me. Her eyes asked a question she didn't say out loud. I answered without turning to her. "You don't need to clear anything tonight. Or ever." Margaret stood. "As long as you're in this family." I cut in, still calm. "We're not discussing membership. We're discussing consent." That word made several people uncomfortable. I didn't soften it. I picked up my coat and draped it over my arm. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. No, I said when Margaret told me to sit. I'm ending a scene. Emily stood beside me, her chair scraped softly. She didn't touch the envelope. For the first time that night, Margaret didn't have a response ready. And that was the moment I knew something fundamental had shifted, even if no one else could name it yet. If you're here for stories told with clarity, restraint, and real consequences, you're in the right place. Take a second to like this video. Subscribe if these stories speak to you, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from tonight. This is one of those stories that's worth staying with until the end. Now let me take you back to a table dressed in white, a room full of polite smiles, and the exact moment a single name changed the balance of everything. 3 years earlier, after Daniel died, Emily and I moved into Margaret's house because it was practical. That was the word everyone used. Practical. It sounded neutral, responsible, almost temporary. Daniel's insurance payout was tied up in probate, my income had narrowed overnight, and the house I lived in suddenly felt too large, too quiet, and too expensive to defend on one salary. Margaret offered space, stability, what she called family structure. She said it the way companies describe benefits. At first, it looked reasonable. The house was paid off. Meals happened on schedule. There were rules, but they were framed as tradition. Decisions were framed as generosity. Gratitude was assumed, not requested. I noticed that difference early. I filed it away. Emily was 13 then, old enough to notice patterns, young enough to accept explanations when they were delivered calmly and by an adult who spoke with certainty. She was grieving. I was managing logistics. Margaret stepped in with lists and timelines and a voice that never needed to be raised. "I'll handle the calendar," she said. "It's easier if one person does." Richard handled finances. Margaret handled the house. I was positioned as the beneficiary of both. "You need time to recover," Margaret told me. "Let us carry things for a while." I let her. At first, Emily helped the way children do when they want to feel useful. Clearing dishes after dinner, folding towels if she was already in the laundry room, watching younger cousins during holidays so adults could talk without interruption. Each task came with a smile and a sentence that sounded harmless. "She's so responsible. She likes feeling needed. It keeps her grounded." I watched. I noted. I didn't intervene. Not because I agreed, but because every task came attached to a reminder of our position. "We're helping you get back on your feet." Daniel would have wanted stability for Emily. "You don't want to complicate things right now." There was always a right time later. Later became a habit. Margaret controlled the household schedule. Meals were announced, not discussed. Guests appeared with short notice. Expectations were embedded, not explained. If Emily finished her homework early, she was redirected. If she studied too long, she was reminded that real life doesn't pause for books. I corrected things quietly. I thanked Emily privately. I made sure she still had weekends when I could. I told myself balance could be negotiated from inside the structure. That assumption was my mistake. Power doesn't negotiate. It assigns. By the second year, help stopped being optional. It became assumed. Emily stopped asking if she could go out with friends. She started asking when she needed to be back. That change didn't happen all at once. It never does. I noticed she began apologizing before speaking. "Sorry, I didn't know if..." "Sorry, I'll fix it." "Sorry, I forgot." Nothing was ever broken. Margaret never raised her voice. That was her skill. Control without volume. Disapproval without evidence. She spoke as if she were narrating reality instead of shaping it. She needs discipline. She's lucky to learn humility early. We're preparing her for the real world. I stayed quiet because quiet kept the peace. Quiet kept the roof. Quiet kept probate uncomplicated. Quiet felt strategic. I told myself endurance was maturity. What I didn't understand then was that patience, when observed by the wrong people, looks like permission. And permission becomes policy. By the third year, Emily had become invisible at family gatherings unless something needed doing. She was praised for being low maintenance. I was praised for raising her right. I accepted those compliments. That part is on me. Emily learned quickly that effort didn't earn relief. It earned more responsibility. Compliance was rewarded publicly. Fatigue was corrected privately. One afternoon, I found her ironing tablecloths while listening to a recorded lecture for school. Multitasking had become automatic. I told her to stop. She asked me a question I wasn't ready for. Will Margaret mind? That question stayed with me. Margaret's authority wasn't loud. It was procedural. She didn't punish. She reclassified. Emily wasn't mistreated. She was included differently. And because there was no visible cruelty, no shouting, no insults, no bruises, I told myself we could endure it until things resolved legally, until funds were released, until we had options. Years pass quickly when you're waiting for a better moment. I didn't realize then that silence wasn't protecting Emily. It was training her. Training her to ask permission for time that already belonged to her. Training her to apologize for space she was allowed to take. Training her to believe that usefulness was the price of belonging. I was watching it happen and calling it stability. And every day I waited, the structure around her hardened just enough to feel permanent. By the time Emily turned 14, helping wasn't something she did. It was something she was. No one announced the shift. There was no conversation where expectations were clarified. It happened the way these things usually do, quietly, through repetition. A task here, an assumption there, a pattern that didn't need to be stated because everyone already acted as if it were true. Emily became the one who noticed when dishes needed clearing before anyone asked. The one who stepped in when younger cousins grew restless. The one who stayed behind after gatherings while other kids drifted off to their rooms. People praised her for it, constantly. She's so mature for her age. She doesn't need watching. You raised her right. Those compliments landed on me, not on her. Emily received the workload. I received the approval. Margaret never assigned tasks directly when others were listening. She had a better system. She spoke in observations. The table looks crowded. The kitchen could use a reset. The little ones need supervision. Emily learned to translate. By the time the sentence finished, Emily was already moving. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself it was teaching responsibility. I told myself Emily didn't mind because she didn't complain. But not complaining isn't the same as consenting. I know that now. What I didn't see at first was how the responsibilities multiplied. Helping became reliability. Reliability became expectation. Expectation became entitlement. Emily stopped being asked if she could help. She was thanked after the fact, as if the decision had never been hers to make. Margaret framed everything as inclusion. She's part of the household. We all pull our weight here. This is good preparation. Preparation for what, exactly, was never specified. Emily still did well in school. That became part of the justification. If she could manage grades and chores, then clearly nothing was wrong. If she looked composed, then clearly she wasn't overwhelmed. I watched her become efficient. That efficiency worried me more than exhaustion would have. She planned her homework around dinner schedules she didn't control. She studied in short bursts, always alert for interruption. Her body learned to stay half available, even when she was supposed to be resting. One evening, I noticed she packed her backpack with the precision of someone expecting to be delayed. Snacks, notes color-coded. Everything prepared in case time was taken from her without warning. I asked her why she did that. She shrugged. Just in case. Margaret's genius was never cruelty. It was normalization. If Emily hesitated, Margaret didn't scold. She redirected. You can do it after. It won't take long. We're counting on you. If Emily looked tired, Margaret reframed it. That's life. Everyone gets tired. She'll thank us later. I corrected things quietly when I could. I told Emily she was allowed to say no. I told her her work mattered. But those conversations happened behind closed doors, while the rules that shaped her days lived out in the open. Private reassurance couldn't compete with public expectation. By the middle of the second year, Emily stopped asking permission to rest. She waited until she was dismissed. That change was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. I tried to intervene gently. Emily has a lot on her plate. I said once. Margaret smiled. She handles it beautifully. That was the end of the discussion. I told myself we were guests. I told myself we owed patience. I told myself confrontation would create instability we couldn't afford yet. What I didn't account for was how quickly a child adapts when adaptation is rewarded. Emily learned that being agreeable made things smoother, that anticipation prevented correction, that being useful kept her invisible. That invisibility came at a cost. She stopped volunteering opinions. She waited for instructions even in situations where none were necessary. When asked what she wanted, she paused too long, as if searching for the version of herself that used to know. One afternoon, I found her ironing tablecloths while listening to a recorded lecture through one earbud. She hadn't been asked to iron. She had noticed they were wrinkled. I told her to stop. She looked at me, uncertain. I was almost done. That's not the point, I said. She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Will Margaret mind?" That question landed harder than any argument could have. Margaret hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Her authority lived in Emily's anticipation of it. I realized then that Emily wasn't helping anymore. She was managing someone else's expectations before they were spoken, and I was still calling it peace. I didn't confront Margaret that day. I didn't make a scene. I didn't draw lines yet, but something shifted in me. Because once you see how a system teaches a child to erase herself politely, you can't pretend it's harmless. And you can't unknow your role in allowing it. The trigger wasn't dramatic. It never is. It arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon, sandwiched between a utility notice and a school newsletter I usually skimmed. The subject line was precise, almost polite. Volunteer commitment concern. The email came from Emily's school counselor. It was copied to me and to Margaret. That detail stopped me. The counselor explained that Emily had missed a scheduled weekend shift at a local community center. Nothing accusatory, just concern. A suggestion that Emily might want to reconsider her commitments if she was having trouble balancing responsibilities. I read it twice, then a third time. Emily hadn't mentioned a volunteer shift. At dinner that night, Margaret brought it up herself. She didn't wait for me to ask. She held her phone like evidence already weighed and categorized. "This doesn't look good," she said calmly. "People notice these things." I asked a simple question. How was Emily scheduled in the first place? Margaret didn't answer directly. She smiled the way people do when they believe the answer is obvious. She said she was available. Emily's eyes dropped to her plate. I already knew the truth. That Saturday, Emily had been helping prepare for Richard's business dinner. 12 guests, linen tablecloths, polished glassware, setup that started early in the morning and stretched into the afternoon. By the time the volunteer shift began, Emily was still in the kitchen. Margaret reframed it smoothly. She should have managed her time better. Richard nodded. Reliability matters. The counselor followed up the next day, gently suggesting Emily reduce outside commitments until she could demonstrate consistency. Margaret forwarded the email to 3 relatives. "This is what happens when kids aren't held accountable," she wrote. That sentence did something to me. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. Family pressure escalated quickly after that. Suggestions came wrapped in concern, shaped like solutions. Maybe Emily should take a gap year to learn discipline. She could help Aunt Linda's family over the summer. College is expensive. Service builds perspective. No one asked Emily what she wanted. Margaret framed it all as opportunity. Hands-on experience, character development, less entitlement. Emily absorbed it without visible reaction. No tears, no arguments, just nodding. Agreement as a survival reflex. That night, I found her at the kitchen table with a notebook open. She wasn't doing homework. She was making a list. Not of chores, of apologies she might need to make. I sat down beside her and asked one question. "Who scheduled you for the volunteer shift?" She hesitated, then answered carefully, like someone reciting something already rehearsed. "Margaret told the center I was available," she said. "She said it would look good." That was the moment the misunderstanding snapped into focus. This wasn't discipline. It was narrative control. Emily was being positioned publicly as unreliable while being privately overused. Her time was assigned without consent, then her absence was documented as failure. The contrast benefited only one person. The next morning, Margaret sent another message, this one to extended family. Emily is struggling with responsibility. We're increasing structure. We tun your stively of a letade, made with a sumdied airy. I didn't reply. Instead, I stopped reacting and started recording. I pulled bank statements, probate documents, calendar invites, emails forwarded without context. I began keeping timestamps, screenshots, originals. I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. I documented. Margaret noticed the shift. She adjusted her tone. "We're just trying to help," she said over coffee. "You seem tense." I met her eyes. "I'm attentive." That word changed things. Pressure increased. Margaret insisted Emily spend school breaks, earning her keep. Richard offered to connect Emily with relatives who needed help. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Emily watched me closely during those days, waiting for cues, testing whether my calm meant surrender or strategy. I gave her one instruction. Only one. "Don't agree to anything without telling me first." She nodded. Relief flickered, then steadied. Margaret mistook my silence for compliance. She escalated. And by the time she pushed for a formal family discussion about Emily's future direction, everything I needed was already in order. The change didn't come from a fight. It came from a sentence Emily said, without emotion. "I already told them I can't apply." She said it at the kitchen counter, stirring soup that wasn't for us. Her tone was neutral, practiced. "Apply for what?" I asked. "The summer science program," she said. "They need an essay and a recommendation." But Margaret already told Aunt Claire I'd be available full-time in July. I waited. I wanted to hear how she framed it. "She said it wouldn't look good if I committed and backed out," Emily continued. "So I emailed the coordinator and declined." She didn't sound sad. That was the part that broke something in me. I didn't confront Margaret that night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't tell Emily everything I was thinking, either. I learned a long time ago that once you signal a shift too early, people rush to contain it. Instead, I waited. After Emily went to bed, I sat at my desk and opened a folder I hadn't touched in months. Inside were documents Daniel had insisted I keep myself, insurance statements, beneficiary letters, a draft trust agreement his attorney had prepared but never publicly finalized. At the time, it had felt premature, almost morbid. Now it felt precise. I made phone calls the next morning, quiet ones. An estate attorney, a financial administrator, a school counselor who owed me nothing but answered anyway. I didn't ask for permission. I asked for clarification. What I learned was simple. Nothing required us to stay. Nothing required Emily to be available. Nothing required silence. What we had been calling gratitude had no legal weight. What we had been calling obligation had no documentation. That afternoon, Margaret handed Emily a printed list. Summer dates, names, addresses. Tasks neatly aligned in bullet points. Relatives who counted on her. Commitments already framed as favors she would be rude to refuse. Emily took the paper automatically. Her hand moved before her mind could catch up. I watched her reach for a pen. "Emily," I said evenly. Pause. She looked at me, uncertain. I turned to Margaret. "We'll review this later." Margaret didn't bother to soften her response. "There's nothing to review. It's already arranged." I nodded once. "Then it will be easy to revise." Her smile tightened. "Laura, don't complicate things." That sentence was familiar. It had kept me quiet for years. I took the list from Emily's hand and folded it once. Neatly, no creases beyond what was necessary. "We'll get back to you," I said. Margaret's voice sharpened. "You're being ungrateful." I met her eyes. "I'm being accurate." She stared at me, waiting for escalation. I didn't give her one. That night, I explained nothing to Emily. I didn't promise outcomes. I didn't dramatize what might happen next. I gave her one boundary. "From now on," I said, "nothing gets agreed to without you." She studied my face, searching for hesitation. finding none. For the first time in years, she didn't apologize. That was the transfer. Not of money. Not of authority in the room. Of permission. Margaret reacted quickly. She began speaking for Emily more often. Louder, with witnesses. She framed concern as urgency. Emily doesn't manage her commitments well. She needs structure this summer. She shouldn't overreach academically. Each sentence was delivered as fact. None of them were supported by data. I didn't interrupt. I didn't counter in public. I let the statements exist. And then I began preparing the response that didn't require my voice at all. I requested records from the community center, scheduling logs, availability submissions, confirmation emails. I printed school correspondence showing withdrawn applications and declined programs. I compiled timestamps showing overlap between family obligations and missed opportunities. I wasn't building an argument. I was building a sequence. Margaret noticed the paper trail. She adjusted again. "We're family," she said one morning. "We don't need documents to understand each other." I replied, "Documents clarify." Her tone shifted. "You're making this transactional." I didn't correct her. Transactions have records. Power prefers ambiguity. Emily changed during that time. She stopped preemptively explaining herself. When asked about her summer, she said, "I'm not sure yet." When handed suggestions, she said, "I'll think about it." Margaret bristled at the hesitation. "You used to be so decisive," she said. Emily looked at me before answering. That glance told me everything I needed to know. The final attempt came wrapped in generosity. Richard offered to connect Emily with a relative who needed help. Full-time, unpaid, framed as experience. Margaret added, "It would be a good lesson." I said, "We'll respond in writing." That ended the conversation. 2 days later, Margaret announced a formal family meeting. Subject, Emily's future direction. I agreed. Not because I wanted to persuade anyone. Because everything I needed was ready. Emily asked me one question the night before. "Are we in trouble?" I answered honestly. "We're just not available anymore." She nodded. The relief was quiet, but it was there. That was progress. The meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon. Margaret called it a family alignment discussion. The phrase sounded collaborative. The invite list told a different story. Relatives with opinions, no one with authority over Emily's life, an audience that benefited from order but never carried its cost. Emily and I arrived early. Not to speak first, to observe. Margaret opened the meeting calmly. She always did. Her voice carried concern without warmth, structure without flexibility. She spoke about responsibility, about discipline, about preparing a young person for real life. She never once asked Emily a question. Charts of behavior without numbers, patterns without dates, words like structure and expectations used as conclusions instead of premises. When she finished, she turned to me. "Laura, we want to support you. But Emily needs boundaries." I nodded. Agreed. That pause unsettled her. I reached into my bag and placed a thin folder at the center of the table. Not toward Margaret. Toward the space everyone shared. "I brought documentation," I said. The room shifted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain my motives. I stated facts. I presented printed emails from the community center confirming Emily had been scheduled without her consent. Availability submissions traced to Margaret's account. Calendar entries showing overlapping obligations assigned by the household. Margaret tried to interrupt. I lifted one finger. She stopped. Next came school correspondence, declined programs, withdrawn applications, counselor notes referencing missed commitments, each tied to family events Emily hadn't been asked to choose. "This isn't discipline," I said evenly. "It's misrepresentation." Richard leaned forward. "You're interpreting this emotionally." I slid another document across the table, an affidavit prepared by my attorney, not filed, dated. "It's not interpretation," I said. "It's sequence." Margaret's jaw tightened. "What are you accusing me of?" I met her eyes. Positioning my daughter as labor while reducing her future options. Silence followed. Not shock. Calculation. Then I placed the final document down. Not the full trust, just the summary page. Signatures visible. Amounts redacted. "This is funded through Daniel's policy," I said. "It's legally protected. It's designated for Emily's education and living expenses. It doesn't pass through this household." Margaret stared at it. "You never mentioned this." "I wasn't required to." Richard exhaled slowly. "So this is leverage." I shook my head. "It's independence." Margaret's tone sharpened. "After everything we've done for you, you'd undermine the family like this?" I waited, then said, "Support doesn't convert into authority." No one spoke. I gathered the documents calmly. Effective immediately, Emily's schedule is not available for family obligations, volunteer placements, or third-party commitments arranged without parental consent. Margaret stood. "This is inappropriate," I replied. Assigning her time without consent was inappropriate. Emily hadn't spoken once. She didn't need to. The meeting ended without a vote. Authority doesn't survive evidence. It dissolves. As we left, no one followed us. That was the confirmation. The day after the meeting, Margaret called. Her voice was softer than usual, almost fatigued. "We should talk. Just us," she said. I declined. "There's nothing unresolved." She tried again that afternoon. "Families don't need documents to function." I replied, "Families function best with clarity." By evening, Richard intervened. "Let's slow this down. No one meant harm. We can adjust expectations." Adjust. That was the word of the week. They proposed compromises. Emily could help, occasionally. Schedules would be more flexible. Language would be more careful. None of it addressed consent. None of it returned choice. I listened without interruption. I didn't debate semantics. I didn't defend Emily's rights like a shield in front of an enemy. I let the proposals exist for what they were, a partial acknowledgement. Then I spoke. One statement. Calm, deliberate. "We're not negotiating behavior. We're ending access." The sentence landed hard. Margaret's composure cracked. "You're punishing everyone for a misunderstanding." I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. Instead, the next morning, I sent a formal notice. Polite, brief, documented. It stated that Emily's schedule was no longer available for family obligations, volunteer placements, or third-party commitments arranged without direct parental consent. No accusations, just boundaries. Margaret returned it with handwritten notes in the margins. I didn't acknowledge them. I didn't need to. Emily watched silently as I handled it all. She asked one question. "Are we in trouble?" I answered honestly. "We're just not available anymore." That distinction mattered. It gave her space without judgment. It gave her choice without drama. Margaret made one final attempt. She showed up unannounced, standing in the doorway with posture calibrated to expect compliance. "This doesn't have to be ugly," she said. I remained seated. "It isn't. You're tearing the family apart," she said. I turned slightly so Emily could see she had my full support. "We're choosing a different structure. You're not included in the decisions." Margaret left without another word. The consequence wasn't confrontation. It was exclusion from control. And for the first time since Daniel died, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. We didn't announce our departure. There was no dramatic exit, no final speech. I secured a short-term lease 2 towns over, signed quietly, and scheduled the move for a weekday morning when the house would be empty. Emily packed only what she wanted. Clothes she liked, books she'd hidden in drawers, a framed photo of her father she had kept face down to avoid questions. The last night, Margaret knocked on the door. She didn't come in. She stood carefully. "This isn't necessary," she said. "You're reacting emotionally." A.B. tense of cited later. Affidit round laters abouts of signs. End quote. I met her eyes. "I'm acting deliberately." She sighed. "You'll regret cutting ties like this." I didn't argue. "We're not cutting ties, we're changing distance." The next morning, as movers loaded the truck, Richard arrived. He looked tired. Not angry. Just defeated. "This went too far," he said quietly. "She didn't mean it the way you took it." I nodded. Intent doesn't cancel impact. He hesitated. Margaret's having a hard time. I waited. He added nothing. We're not leaving out of spite, I said. We're leaving to stop repeating something. He looked toward the house. Then back at Emily, standing beside me, holding her backpack like a shield. She's a good kid, he said. I know, I replied. That was all. As we drove away, Emily didn't look back. She watched the road ahead, steady and silent. At the new place, nothing matched. The furniture was temporary, the walls were bare, but the air felt lighter. That first evening, Emily asked if she needed to check in with anyone about her plans for the week. No, I said. Just tell me what you want to do. She thought for a long moment, then smiled. Small, real. The departure wasn't victory, it was relief. The months after our departure unfolded quietly. Our new apartment was modest, walls bare, furniture simple, but it breathed differently. Every corner carried less tension than the rooms we had left behind. The air wasn't filled with expectation or surveillance. It was ours to shape, to inhabit on our terms. Emily adjusted quickly. Her routines were now her own. Study blocks, rest, moments for projects that excited her instead of obligations that exhausted her. She had time that didn't require explanation or justification. She started asking for what she needed, not what someone else dictated. I watched her carefully, not as a mother policing, but as a witness. There were subtle shifts at first. Her posture no longer slouched under invisible burdens. Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who could make a decision without fear of immediate correction. Her eyes, once alert for cues about how to behave, now held curiosity, focus, and quiet determination. The first weeks were a study in recalibration. She laughed at the small, unremarkable things. She worked on her science project in long, uninterrupted stretches. She read aloud to herself, her voice filling spaces that had once been tense with unspoken rules. Occasionally, I caught myself watching her and marveling at how little she needed to function, how quickly she had adapted once the external pressure disappeared. She started reclaiming the time that had been silently assigned to others. The first sign of independence came unexpectedly. Emily decided to reapply to the science program she had declined months before. This time, the application went out on her terms. The recommendation came directly from a teacher who knew her work, not her availability. There was no one to arrange her commitments or reframe her choices. She was in charge, and she knew it. The trust handled expenses quietly, no approvals, no commentary, just transaction records and confirmations. That was all she needed. Meanwhile, Margaret's narrative began to unravel quietly, too. Without Emily absorbing responsibility, expectations rotated uncomfortably among others. Tasks that had once been assumed now required explicit articulation. People noticed. Authority, once unquestioned, now had to justify itself. Margaret still hosted gatherings and smiled, but the room no longer adjusted around her as automatically. I heard through the usual channels, indirect, careful that Margaret called me difficult. I took that as confirmation of accuracy. Systems built on unspoken labor fail when the labor leaves. Emily didn't celebrate her newfound autonomy. She adjusted to it. She discovered how much time belonged to her when no one else claimed it first. That was enough. Our life settled into something quieter than I expected. Not dramatically happier, not celebrated, but predictable in the right ways. Healthier, stable. Occasionally, we passed Margaret's old neighborhood. Emily glanced briefly at the houses but didn't linger. She returned immediately to reading aloud from her notebook, unbothered, unhurried. That quiet disregard carried more weight than any argument could have. We had no need for revenge. There were no sharp words, no confrontations, no public victories. We had clarity, boundaries, and freedom. And that was enough. Life at the new apartment settled into a rhythm that felt deliberate. Not forced, not dramatic, just intentional. Emily's days belonged to her, and watching her navigate that space without preemptive apologies or silent compliance was a lesson in patience rewarded. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare, but every object carried meaning. Her desk became the center of her projects, The couch was for quiet reading. Even the kitchen, once a stage for assigned labor, now smelled faintly of her own experiments, soups she wanted to make, bread she tried on weekends. Each choice reinforced autonomy. Emily's confidence grew steadily. She spoke first in conversations. She asked for what she wanted without hesitation. She made small decisions: what to cook, which books to read, how to spend her free time. Those decisions were hers alone, yet she exercised them with care, with consideration, not fear. Within weeks, the science program she had initially declined was no longer a missed opportunity but an active pursuit. This time, the application process was completely under her control. She reached out to teachers herself. She drafted essays on her own. She submitted forms without oversight. Acceptance letters arrived quietly. There were no celebrations, no dramatic announcement. Only confirmation. The opportunities were hers. The trust handled expenses. Transactions were clear, automatic, and free from commentary. Emily didn't need approval or guidance. She was learning the language of independence in real time, and the record kept her safe. Margaret's household, meanwhile, began to experience subtle fractures. Without Emily as the default helper, tasks rotated unexpectedly. Expectations had to be stated explicitly. People who had relied on assumptions suddenly confronted the reality that labor required negotiation, not obedience. Margaret's control, once procedural and silent, now demanded justification. Smiles persisted, but authority had lost the seamless influence it once carried. Rumors traveled cautiously. Margaret labeled me difficult, a term meant to warn, perhaps shame. I received second-hand accounts from distant relatives who didn't understand the boundary we had drawn. I took it as validation. Difficult wasn't a critique. It was accuracy manifested. Emily, for her part, never asked about Margaret. Not out of anger, not out of unresolved tension, but because the chapter no longer pressed on her. Her focus was forward, not backward. We discovered the quiet power of absence. Tasks that once passed unnoticed in Emily's hands were reassigned. People had to negotiate time, labor, and attention openly. Authority faltered when it could no longer operate invisibly. That was the lesson Margaret learned without words. Months passed. Our routines deepened. Emily developed study blocks, creative projects, and time to herself. She made decisions that had once been preemptively determined. Her laughter filled the apartment without hesitation. It was light, unmeasured, without expectation. Occasionally, she asked questions about minor logistics. Do I need to check in with anyone about my plans for the week? I answered simply, no. Just tell me what you want to do. The smile that followed was small, but real, a subtle acknowledgement that the world could be lived on her terms. The day she left for the program, she hugged me firmly. Thank you, she said, not for the money, not for privilege, for the boundary, for the restoration of choice, for the reclaiming of time. I watched her walk through the campus gate. No sense of triumph, no revenge, only completion. Life after that was quieter, intentional, and measured. We no longer corrected misaligned expectations or navigated hidden obligations. We existed deliberately. Some families mistake access for ownership. They confuse endurance with loyalty. We no longer did. Months later, I ran into Margaret at a grocery store near my office. It wasn't planned. She looked smaller somehow, or perhaps just unframed. We exchanged nods, polite, brief. "Emily doing well?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. She waited, as if expecting more. There wasn't. Emily never asked about her. Not out of anger. Out of absence. That chapter was closed. We lived differently. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, persistent. Emily's growth was the evidence. Our boundaries were the proof. If you stayed with this story, you saw the quiet transformation. A mother reclaiming agency. A daughter reclaiming time. A system of assumed authority confronted not with noise, but with clarity, documentation, and calm determination. This story isn't about drama or spectacle, it's about the power of deliberate action, measured boundaries, and the courage to act with precision when the world expects passive compliance. If this story stayed with you, you can follow the channel for more journeys told with clarity, boundaries, and real consequences.